I'm also teaching a drugs and human behavior class this summer, so I'll send out an email about that later on. So we finished up talking about the auditory system, and we will pick up with the other senses. All right, so we've talked about the visual system, we talked about the auditory system. We still have left touch, pain, smell, taste, and we'll also talk about our balance and orienting system, or the vestibular system, which we talked a little smidge about last time. So when we talk about the body senses, most people usually think of the body senses as our sense of touch. We refer to this as our somatosenses. There are a couple of different kinds of perceptual processes that we'll talk about today, fairly briefly. One of these is what we call haptic perception. It's one of the ways we get kind of what we call force feedback information. So, for example, when you go to turn the steering wheel of your car, you get sort of feedback information about that as you're going around a corner. You can feel the wheel change a bit, or if you're trying to shift a car and it's harder to shift than you might realize. Other things that happen all the time are when you go to open a door and you don't know how much force to apply to try to open the door. How many of you have ever sat outside of a bathroom waiting for somebody to come out and the bathroom is empty? Yeah, you've all done that because you go up and try the door handle because you don't realize it sticks or something weird. That's that kind of haptic perception where you don't get kind of enough the right kind of feedback. So there are 4 types of receptors for touch that respond to pressure, texture, pattern, and vibration, in addition to thermoreceptors, which respond to temperature. So our somatosenses are much more complex, a bunch of different kinds of receptors that provide all kinds of different information. But this is how we're able to do things like identify things by touch. So when you're digging in your pocket, for example, trying to find your keys, or if you have any money, or your wallet, or your phone, you can identify those things by their texture, etc. Of course, when your phone goes off, that's where you get that vibration that tells you your phone's going off. One of the important things to understand about our body senses and our somatosenses is they function just like all of our other senses, in that we have both bottom-up and top-down processing. How many of you ever reached for your phone thinking that it has been vibrating and it has not? Everyone, right? Everyone's done that at least once. I've done it and my phone's not even in my pocket. So where that weird influence comes from. Touch, of course, just like everything else, has contralateral representation. Right side of your body is in the left side of your brain. Left side of your body is in the right side of your brain. Important thing to understand about cortical space, particularly with the somatosensation, is this issue of what we call cortical magnification. This is related to also the density of the receptors in your skin. But the basic idea is some parts of your body are represented with much more cortex, much more brain. And as a result, they're much more sensitive because there's much more neural processing associated with those skin areas. And again, we call that cortical magnification because they're magnified in the cortex. There are similarly what and where pathways in the somatosenses, much like there are with the visual system and the auditory system, that identify what and where things are. And all of these systems work together. That is, they aren't completely independent. That is, our touch senses and our auditory senses and our visual senses work together. That's how we're able to do things like catch a ball, right? That requires visual information and haptic perception information, because that tells your brain where your hand is in 3D space. You also have other receptors in your muscles and tendons that help tell you where you are in 3-dimensional space. But to get back to this idea of cortical magnification, one of the things we see in your skin and face is you have a great deal more of these pressure receptors, what are called Merkel's discs, and the low-frequency vibrating receptors. These we have a lot more of in our face and our fingertips. So one of the things we can do to try to measure how sensitive your skin is to use this thing we call a 2-point threshold. The 2-point threshold is simply the point at which you notice that there are 2 points here instead of 1. So how far apart do we have to get this, what we call a stesiometer, apart before you notice that it's 2 points instead of 1, and that's the point at which you have reached your 2-point threshold. Now I know this sounds crazy, that it would be this far apart and you would not know that that's 2 separate points touching your skin. But in fact, you can get up to about this far apart on your shoulder. So if you look at the 2-point threshold, these are in centimeters. So if you look for your fingertips have the lowest 2-point thresholds, just get a couple millimeters apart, and you can tell that it's 2 points. For your chest, your upper arm, your back, and your upper thighs, it's out at here at 70 centimeters. This is about 3 inches. About 2.75 to 3 inches. So it's this far apart before you notice that it's 2 separate points. This has some important behavioral analogs. So we're going to quickly switch back to Top Hat. I want you to speculate really quickly on what, let's see, let me find the question I wanted to ask you. Why does a paper cut cause you more pain than, say, a much longer cut on your forearm or your leg? So why would that hurt much more than, say, on your arm or leg? So to answer that, and I'll review that here in just a couple minutes to answer that. Think about it. Okay, so looks like most of you have kind of gotten the basic idea. The density of pain receptors is certainly higher in your fingertips for all of your receptors. And also you get that then cortical magnification. You've got a lot more brain power associated with it. Any other areas that you might have on your own noticed are particularly sensitive? Anyone ever gotten a pimple on the inside of their nose? How painful is that, right? Much more painful than one anywhere else. For some reason, I don't know why the inside of your nose should be so sensitive. What about your lips? Like, anyone ever split their lip open or gotten, yeah, it's really painful because you have a lot more nerve endings. There are, of course, other areas, your genitals, and, your nipples also have a lot of cortical magnification, which is why, there's one of the reasons why that stuff feels good, but also why it's very painful. So, if you want to take my human sexuality class, we could talk all about body piercings and their issues with pain and pain perception. But we won't get into that today. So, excellent. Any other questions about that? Well, that gets us right into pain. Apparently I did not animate this slide. Pain perception is an area where there's a lot of real interest in understanding and trying to particularly understand the pharmacology of pain, because this is a huge problem we have in trying to solve people's pain problems, but also not end up with them being addicted to opioids, that sort of thing. So pain indicates damage or potential damage to the body. Tissue damage is transduced by pain receptors. There are actually two different kinds of pain receptors, what we call the A delta fibers. That's that quick, sharp pain. And then the C fibers are sort of more long, dull, what we call inflammatory pain. So different pain from getting stabbed than if you've, injured your knee and it's now swollen. You get different kinds of pain there. Now, you probably get both if you get stabbed, so let's try to avoid that. But there are different kinds of pain involved in that, and you've experienced both of these in your lifetime. There are also two pain pathways. There is the sort of where information, sends it to the somatosensory cortex, tells you where you've injured yourself. The other sends motivational and emotional information to the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the frontal lobe. This is our experience of pain. This tells us what hurts and where. The rest of this is our experience of pain. So that provides the motivational need to try to solve the pain, try to stop the pain, also the emotional response to pain. And again, everyone here has had some kind of experience with pain that is differing in terms of its motivational and emotional properties, right? The worst is, of course, pain that comes out of nowhere on an everyday, sort of average everyday basis. What is the most, I would say, emotionally fraught kind of physical pain? Anybody have any ideas? Like, what's most likely to genuinely sort of catch you by surprise and upset you? When you do something dumb like stub your toe or run into furniture that is always there, right? It's that kind of out of the blue, you walk right into something, knock your knee. That is usually much more painful than, other kinds of minor aches and pains, or paper cuts, again, out of the middle of nowhere. All of a sudden, you just are sliced and bleeding. So that's where we get into this kind of emotional response to pain. Referred pain is a feeling of pain when sensory information from internal and external areas converge on the same nerve cells in the spinal cord. So this can be problematic, particularly for internal pain. Anyone know what the probably biggest referred pain problem might be? Yeah. Yes, exactly. Excellent. Yeah, particularly for men, and here's one of the things that's very important when you start to get older, men and women have very different symptoms of heart attack. But for men in particular, the referred pain shooting down the arm is sort of the primary symptom of a heart attack. Now, it's problematic when you're somebody like me who has almost torn the rotator cuff, and so I get that kind of pain all the time. So one day I'll have a heart attack and I will never pay any attention to it. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Women oftentimes have back pain and are much more likely to have nausea as one of their symptoms of a heart attack. But excellent. So pain intensity is, importantly, very subjective. This is one of the biggest problems with trying to understand and treat pain is we generally have to rely on people to tell us that they're in pain. And hope that they're telling us the truth about that kind of pain. We do know that you can, without any sort of influence whatsoever, you can block pain from the top down, certainly without even necessarily any drugs. And this is what we call the gate control theory of pain. So the signals arriving from pain receptors in the body can be stopped or gated either by interneurons in the spinal cord or via feedback from what's called the para-aqueductal gray. That's what the PAG stands for. The para-aqueductal gray is a part of the brain in the brainstem. This is where morphine and opioid drugs exert their influence, is they cause the para-aqueductal gray to block pain. Natural endorphins do this as well. So if you're injured, particularly in sort of a sudden injury, you'll get a rush of endorphins that will block the pain short term. And basically, the purpose of that, from a survival perspective, is most of the, we sort of evolved in the wild, and so if we were injured, it probably meant we had to get from somewhere to a place of safety, and so those endorphins will allow you to do that, to get to a place of safety, and then afterwards you'll feel a lot more pain. But we also know that you can emotionally or sort of cognitively block pain. We know that this is certainly how placebos work. You can give somebody something that they think will relieve their pain, and it will actually relieve their pain. And you can actually see that in functional magnetic resonance imaging studies. So it's pretty interesting. Also, again, very difficult to study. Trying to get people to rate their pain, very subjective, very individual. Different kinds of pain, sharp, stabbing, throbbing, constant pain. So it's a huge problem because it's really hard to measure. One physiological symptom we see in people who are in quite a bit of pain is increased heart rate, but it's not all that good of a measure. So endorphins block our perception of pain. In fact, opioids, things like morphine, Vicodin, those kinds of drugs, actually work on the same receptors as endorphins. So whenever we have something like an athletic injury or a traumatic injury, oftentimes the endorphins will block that perception of pain. This is particularly problematic for athletic injuries. I want to say we had this discussion earlier in the semester about injuring yourself while out running or out engaging in some sort of athletic sport. And then you don't realize how badly you've injured yourself until much later. It's one of the reasons why athletes, particularly athletic trainers and coaches, have to be mindful of that when somebody's injured during a sporting competition. Another very big problem, particularly for people who suffer from this, is pain with no physical cause, and we call this neuropathic pain, or sometimes peripheral neuropathy. Usually this starts with an injury. Some sort of injury has caused a pain response, and then the pain response just never shuts off. Or there's some sort of damage or disease affecting the somatosensory nervous system. This kind of idiopathic neuropathic pain with no clear cause is incredibly difficult to treat, but also incredibly important to treat. People who have this kind of peripheral neuropathy oftentimes can't stand to even have their skin touched, like their clothes cause extreme pain. Whenever anything touches them, they get sort of extreme pain. And oftentimes things like opioid pain relievers don't provide much relief. There's a lot of work being done in this area. You probably see lots of commercials about things like Lyrica used to treat this kind of pain. It turns out some of the drugs used to treat schizophrenia, so antipsychotics, seem to have some benefit for this kind of pain. Any questions about that? We're going to talk about pharmacology. Let me back up a minute. Definitely not today, but after the exam. And so we'll talk a little bit about treating pain and some of the issues with treating pain. But a couple of things I just want to preview, give you an idea of why this is such a strange area to work in. There are clear genetic differences in treating people with pain. People with red hair oftentimes are very difficult to treat for pain. So people with red hair, because of the melanocortin gene, get less response out of local anesthetics, so oftentimes have difficulty getting pain relief at the dentist. So for example, things like Novocaine. They also metabolize drugs much more quickly. So people with red hair actually require about twice as much anesthesia as somebody who does not have red hair. So we're going to get into some of those issues and talk about those, particularly in this issue of pain relief. So the next sort of stop in the body senses is our body position, movement, and balance. So we have sensory receptors that provide information we need to perceive the position and movement of our limbs, head, and body. In my physiological psychology class, we talk a lot about this in terms of different kinds of sensory receptors that respond to stretch and tension of muscles and tendons, and those provide lots of important feedback to keep us upright, to keep us moving, keep us from injuring ourselves, etc. Part of that is our balance and orienting system we call the vestibular system. The vestibular system is in the inner ear. It's those three fluid-filled semicircular canals and adjacent organs located next to the cochlea in each inner ear. And this is what maintains our balance. So as you're moving in 3D space or you're moving your head, your vestibular system is responding with the movement of fluid or lymph, and that provides us with information sort of about where we are in three-dimensional space, or certainly relative to gravity. One of the important things to understand is visual feedback is a really important part of the vestibular system. That is, our visual system actually calibrates our vestibular system. And so you can balance much more easily if you can see. So simple way to test this is to stand on one foot, close your eyes, and see how long you can do it with your eyes closed versus your eyes open. Much harder to do with your eyes closed. And part of this is from what we call the vestibular-ocular reflex. That is, these are two systems that are directly tied to one another and help calibrate one another. Anyone here get motion sickness? Seasick? Anyone? Well, that's primarily due to this vestibular-ocular reflex. What's happening is, for most people who get motion sickness, is their vestibular system is registering motion. How many of you get car sick in the back seat? Anybody? They have to ride in the front seat? That's because that visual information, in fact, if somebody gets car sick, sitting in the front seat is a good solution. Because in the back seat, you don't get as much visual information showing you that you're moving through the world. Same thing if you're out on a ship or a boat. The best thing to do is look at the horizon, because that will let your visual system know that you're moving. The worst thing to do is to sort of stay inside where you can't see. Also, if you're somebody who gets motion sickness, I would avoid the alcohol. It's one of the biggest mistakes people make on cruises is they think that drinking will somehow improve their motion sickness. Well, they'll, I guess, care less about it, but it will actually make them more sick. Because in fact, this vestibular-ocular reflex is the center of roadside sobriety testing. So the three planes of rotation in the vestibular canals are matched by our eye muscles. So as our eyes move, so does the vestibular system. So our eyes can automatically adjust to rapid head movements, but not to other movements. So if your head's moving, your eyes can adjust. Your eyes don't adjust very well to being in things like a car. The visual system helps calibrate that vestibular system, helps keep us grounded, tell us where we are, if we're moving or not. In fact, the visual system can override the vestibular system and trick you into thinking you're moving when you're not. Anyone been sitting at a stoplight in their car? The car next to you rolls backwards and you slam on the brakes thinking that you're moving forward? This doesn't happen as much now that nobody has nobody has manual transmission. Anyone been on the metro? This one's happened to me a couple times. Particularly someplace like DuPont where the trains are right next to each other and the train next to you leaves and you like almost fall because you don't notice that yours isn't moving. Well, that's where the visual system has overridden your vestibular system and tricked you into thinking that you're moving when you're not. So that's what we call implied motion. This is the reason why motion simulator rides are so effective, because they use your visual system and your vestibular system together. So as you're watching a movie about moving, like moving through the world, let's say you're riding a roller coaster. Anyone ever been on a motion simulator? You probably hadn't realized it. So like the Simpsons ride at Universal Studios, part of the Harry Potter ride is motion simulated. That is, you actually aren't moving, you just think that you're moving. So you're actually in a car that tilts back and forth and moves up and down, while you're watching a film doing the same thing, and it tricks you into thinking you're moving when you're actually not. So it's usually a combination of real movement and otherwise. Vegas has some really good, if you ever go to Vegas, make sure you do one of the, like every casino has a motion simulator ride. Caesar's Palace used to have this really cool one that was 3D IMAX. That was really cool. So I highly recommend that. Motion sickness is another problem with the vestibular-ocular reflex. We have one exception, which I'm sure none of you have ever experienced because you're not old enough to drink. They say with tongue in cheek. In theory, if you might have gone out and drank too much, you might end up with what we call the bed spins. And what's happened is you have changed the density of the fluid in your vestibular system, and when you go to lay down, it thinks you're still moving. And in fact, what happens is you lay down and it goes wee and wheels around inside your vestibular system, making you think that your bed is moving when in fact it's not. Everyone, of course, knows the tried and true method to solve the bed spins is what? 1 foot on the floor, right? It's the first thing you try. What's the next thing you try? It's really bad. You lay on the floor. Just me? Is this just me that's had this problem? Or you can hold onto the carpet. Hey, it hasn't happened in a long time, so it'll happen. Anyway, so the vestibular-ocular reflex is actually the basis for roadside sobriety testing. Can't get that out for some reason. Anyone besides me been through a roadside sobriety test? Just me again? I've passed all of them, so I couldn't even tell you how many I've been through. Part of it is I used to work in nightclubs, and so I was often on the road at like 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, and you do a lot of roadside sobriety tests when that happens, particularly when you smell like liquor. So, a couple things they do is they do the finger to nose, so they'll have you tilt your head back. Usually they make you close your eyes too, touch your finger to your nose. Sometimes they'll have you do that on 1 foot too, which is really hard to do. You're hammered. The other is what's called the horizontal gaze nystagmus. And basically, they have you follow a light or their thumb or something. That's what he's doing here. And basically, you can't do that very well. The one-leg stand, probably practice that. The other one is the walk and turn. So they'll have you heel to toe. You have to have your hands out by your side. I can't even do it sober, which I swear to God I'm sober. It's not something. Drinking and teaching is never things that mix well. So that's the walk and turn. You have to just sort of avoid doing the catwalk walk when you do that. The other things they have you do is you have to say the alphabet without singing it, right? Which is harder than you think. And then you also have to do the alphabet backwards. So B, Y, X, W. I don't know. I have to think about it from there. So most of these are designed to test impairment in the vestibular system because it's the one that's most affected by alcohol. Any questions about that? Aside from that, you now get to talk about what a lush I am. So, last stop in our review of the senses is to talk about the chemical senses. The chemical senses are smell and taste. They're very different. Everything else we've really talked about is physics, right? So sound, light, pressure, force. All of these things are basic physics properties. The olfactory system and what we call gustatory system are chemical systems, and so they are responding to chemicals dissolved either on your tongue or on what's called the olfactory mucosa, which is a really gross word to say, which is your olfactory system or sense of smell. First thing to know is our sense of smell is intimately related to our emotional and social behavior. Really interesting stuff in the science of smell. Things like we prefer people for romantic partners that don't smell like us, smell different from us. Anyone know what the evolutionary explanation for that might be? Yeah. Diversity, yeah, genetic diversity. It also turns out the more different you are, the better your offspring's immune systems are. It's kind of interesting. So that's one thing. We do also respond socially to smell in ways that we aren't particularly aware. This one's my favorite of them all, is strippers make the most money when they are ovulating. Well, female strippers, I should say. Male strippers is a whole different thing. But female strippers make the most money when they're ovulating. That is when they're fertile. And the only way that men that are tipping them would be able to know that is through smell. So it's one of those things that they aren't consciously aware of, but there is clear data in that area. So smell's kind of a weird thing. It drives us in ways that we don't really know. Certainly we're not as olfactory as most animals are. In fact, we respond very little to pheromones. The part of the brain that's responsible for responding to pheromones is pretty much gone for most for humans. It's simply a responsive at the olfactory mucosa level. So the way this works for smell particularly is odorant molecules just travel through the nose to the olfactory epithelium where they bind to receptors. Currently, the view of scent is it's where there's different receptors sort of along the olfactory epithelium. And so where those receptors are located depends on what you end up located and responding. Depends on what you smell. So these olfactory receptor neurons are the receptor cells that initiate our sense of smell. And then those groups of olfactory receptor neurons send their axons to the olfactory bulb, which is a brain structure located above the nasal cavity beneath the frontal lobes. It's about the size of your, I don't know, not even your pinky nail. Pretty tiny. Really all the brain power we put into our sense of smell. So not particularly fine sense of smell compared to, say, your dog. Your dog, huge part of its cortex is devoted to its sense of smell. They can smell in 3 dimensions, which is why the hound dogs can track scents across, miles, etc. And we certainly know that chemical odors can influence sexual behavior. And this is primarily through pheromones, which are biochemical odorants emitted by other members of a species that can affect an animal's behavior or even physiology. Animals respond far more strongly to pheromones. Anyone who's ever had an unspayed or neutered cat knows, particularly an unspayed female cat, they are very problematic at that point because at some point you will have a lot of male cats outside of your house wanting to get in. And that's because they can smell the fact that that female is in heat, as we say, and ready for reproducing. For humans, again, not a lot of real direct pheromone responses. We get things like this data with strippers. We know that females that live together generally end up on the same menstrual cycle, thereabouts, which is very common. Other kind of interesting bits about our sense of smell. It, again, tends to motivate us in ways that we're not particularly aware of. There's a really interesting study done with the men's cross-country track team, cross-country running team, and female undergraduates. So what they did is they used like one of those big lecture halls, had the men's cross-country team, after they'd been out running, come in and just sit anywhere. And then they brought in a group of female undergraduates to have them do something else, and then recorded where they sat. And they were much more likely to sit where the sweaty men had just been sitting. Weird. Other strange parts of this, women have much better senses of smell. I have this on here I don't. We'll back up a second. Women have much better senses of smell than men do. In fact, they can identify odorants at much lower concentrations. Firefighters are actually trained. If women report smelling gas, for example, they're trained to respond, and men don't. Let's just say that. They are trained to respond to men. Pregnant women in particular have very, very strong senses of smell. And part of that is results in, I should say, that they can usually identify their infant by smell within the first day. Some very strange research in this area. Women, they'll bring in, this is really gross, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Because this is stuck in my head, I feel like I should share it with everyone, and you can all be disgusted by it with me. Each woman brings in their baby's diaper pail, and then they smell a bunch of them and rate how pleasant they smell, and they always think that their infant's diaper pail smells better than other infants' diaper pails. I know, it's gross, right? I don't know who does this research or who signs up to be in this research. I know nothing about that. But if you're interested, there's a pretty cool book. It's a little bit older now. I don't know if they've updated it. It's called What the Nose Knows. But it's lots of interesting, weird stuff on our sense of smell. So, again, stuff goes in through the nose, interacts with the olfactory epithelium, which is where all this stuff is located, and then it goes up to the olfactory bulb, which is a tiny little part of the brain up here. Really interesting stuff on top-down processing of perception. One of the things we know is that our sense of smell and taste are directly related to one another, which is why whenever you get a really bad head cold, nothing tastes right. Anyone ever notice that? Because your head's all stuffed up, you can't smell anything, and nothing tastes the same. You get into this particularly when we talk about things like people who are wine snobs. I'm not. I mean, I know what wine tastes good and what doesn't, but aside from that, really couldn't tell me much. But in these interesting studies, they find that people enjoy wine more if you tell them it's more expensive. In my seminar class right now, we've gotten into this whole psychology of cost and price and how it's associated with our experience as a result. So, for example, if you charge somebody $1 for an aspirin, they'll get more pain relief than if you charge them a quarter for an aspirin. Weird. But anyway, you get the same kind of thing with wine. You can read this on your own time. So let's move into our sense of taste. One of the primary responsibilities of taste is to identify things that we probably shouldn't eat, which is why most of us don't like things that are bitter. Right? Because things that are bitter tend to be poisonous. And so bitter is one of those tastes that we generally don't like. We certainly know that some aspects of taste perception are genetic. Certainly things like the density of taste receptors is genetically determined. So there are people who are kind of low on the taster level, and then there are what we call super tasters. And super tasters has very dense taste receptors that one of the results of which is kids that are super tasters are very finicky eaters because things taste so much more potent to them. What things we prefer in terms of taste changes as we get older. Kids love really sour things, and as an adult, you start to like sour things less. Other weird genetic components of taste. How many of you hate cilantro? How many of it tastes like soap? Yeah. Welcome to the gene pool. You and I share the same genetic structure. It is actually genetically determined. There are just people like me that think cilantro tastes like soap. Well, we don't think it does. It tastes like soap to us, and that's an actual identified gene found from the Human Genome Project. So when people look at me like I'm crazy when I say I hate cilantro, it's not my fault. I was born that way. God, they put it in everything. right? It's in everything. um, so the tongue is covered with these thousands of tiny bumps, which are called papillae, which contain the taste buds, which house the taste receptor cells. So the taste buds are sort of the organ of taste transduction. This is where things that we're eating get transduced into the actual taste sensation. We have clearly identified 5 different receptor cells, or microvilli, which react to these tastant molecules. There may be a 6th, still early research in this area, but we certainly know, I think we can take the controversial out of the umami. Salt, sour, sweet, and bitter are the sort of 4 you probably have heard more about. Umami is best translated as savory. If you think about unsalted chicken broth, what that might taste like, that would probably be the purest version of savory. Savory and salt tend to go together. There is a emerging belief that we might be able to taste fat. Certainly we know people respond to this combination of salty, sweet, and fat together in ways that really are almost addictive. Michael Pollan talks a lot about this in his books on food. And of course, we tend to really not like things that are bitter, because bitter tends to be more associated with things like poisons. So flavor then is the combination of both our smell and taste experiences. The 2 work together. And there are lots of individual differences in our taste experience. This is an area where we get what we call cross-sensory adaptation. So we talked about sensory adaptation already, where we get exposed to a stimulus, we adapt that out. Well, what happens is if you adapt out sweet, then those sweet receptors are not going to respond no matter what the actual stimulus is, even though the stimulus itself has changed. So after you brush your teeth and drink orange juice, 2 entirely different stimuli, but you will have adapted out the sweet receptors in your tongue, and as a result, your orange juice will taste very sour. That's basically sensory adaptation in your taste experience. This is one of the reasons why people talk a lot about food pairings, like what foods should you serve together or not serve together, what drinks should you serve with what foods. So you can go to restaurants where they suggest which beer to drink with it, which wine to drink with it, which liquor to drink with it, or they'll just bring it to you. So lots of individual differences in that experience, and also sort of as we eat different foods at the same time, we get different tastes. One of the other things, I don't think this is talked about in your book at all, is temperature actually affects our taste perception as well. So things that are hotter tend to taste sweeter, and things that are colder tend to taste more bitter. It's one of the reasons why cold coffee is so not delicious, because it tastes much more bitter. Coffee also oxidizes, so it's a separate issue. But hot things will taste much sweeter. It's the reason why I think cold hot chocolate doesn't taste very good, because it doesn't taste as sweet. When I was growing up, ski resorts sold hot Dr. Pepper. And all I can think of is, how sweet did that have to be? Never drank it, because it just sounds gross. I don't know, try it at home, tell me what you think, but I think it's probably going to be gross. So the woman who taught me sensation and perception, this is the point in her lecture, because she was really funny, but she liked to provide useful information. So she said, if you're going to poison somebody, put it in a hot liquid, because it will taste less bitter. There's your tip for today. I like to provide useful information. Now, don't use that information. I don't want to end up on forensic files. I can see it now. I didn't say that. Anyway, so we get these tasters, non-tasters, and super tasters. So non-tasters really just have very dulled senses of taste, whereas super tasters have very overly developed senses of taste. And as a result, it's really difficult, particularly when they're kids, to get them to eat. questions about our sense of taste or smell, and they work together. Actually, all of our senses work together. We're also very visual eaters. I mean, otherwise Instagram wouldn't work, right? I mean, what would be on Instagram if people didn't take pictures of their food? But we don't like things to look different than we expect them to. How many of you have ever eaten purple mashed potatoes? Yeah. First time you ate them, did you look at them like, are you trying to poison me? But they don't taste any different, right? I mean, really, not really. They're good. It's just weird, I know. So all of this kind of works together. And these are your taste buds. There aren't really those, I don't know if, it takes a long time for this stuff to trickle down. But it used to be this belief that there were different regions of your tongue that were more sensitive to salt, sour, or sweet, and they really aren't. Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about, any questions about taste? Last thing under sensation and perception is to talk a little bit about subliminal perception. One of the biggest problems from a modern marketing perspective is trying to get your product in front of eyeballs. Because nobody watches commercials anymore, right? Everybody, DVRs their stuff and fast forwards through it, or they watch it on Netflix. Much fewer people are actually watching commercials. So a couple things you see are things like sensory branding to associate the sights and sounds of exciting things with a product, right? Coors Light commercials with lots of people having fun, lots of half-naked people, right? Oh, I should go do that. I should drink that. They try to basically put their product in with people having a good time, right? The other thing, of course, we get a lot of is product placement. So, and you see this a lot. You can always tell if a product's been placed because if you can see a brand name on it, somebody has paid for it to appear on television. And you'll see people like the Aquafina bottle is always like this, where they can see the label, and they'll sit there and drink it and hold it in front of the camera for like 20 minutes, so that you see the label. The other one you see a lot, I don't know if you've ever noticed, movies will have one brand of car in them. Everyone ever noticed that? What was I watching the other night? That was all Mercedes. And Jurassic World. I'm like, are you out chasing dinosaurs in a $150,000 G-Wagon? Like, really? Like, that's the car you picked to go out and chase dinosaurs with, is a $150,000 car. I'm thinking a Jeep would have been much more economical. All right, that was my rant for the day. The question, though, is, I mean, it's not going to make me buy a Mercedes, right? I don't have a car at all anymore, so it's certainly not going to make me go out and spend $150,000 on one, even though it can outrun a dinosaur. So we get at this question of subliminal perception. So is this kind of advertising, does it somehow get us to buy things more often? And so when we talk about subliminal stimuli, we're usually talking about things that sort of fall below our conscious awareness. I notice these things a lot, mostly because most movies move along a little too slowly, so I have plenty of time to look around, see what else there is. But in the sort of old school version of subliminal perception, there was this sort of question back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, if like movie theaters were flashing up single frames of buy popcorn stuff, where the stimuli are just strong enough to activate your sensory receptors, but you aren't actually consciously aware of them. So this idea of subliminal perception is this process by which subliminal stimuli act upon the unconscious mind and then influence your behavior. That's the idea. Now, the question, of course, is, does that really happen? So I'm going to show you a couple of examples. One I dug out. I found a website devoted to sort of these 70s era magazine ads that all had weird sexual things stuck in them. Like, you used to be able to find people like in ice cubes and advertisements having sex in the ice cube. Weird. But that's anyone notice anything weird with this? I really couldn't even tell you what they're advertising in this. Let's flip it upside down. Look right there. There's a face in there. Right? Now, whether or not that resulted in them selling more of whatever this underwear or bathing suit it is that they're trying to sell, I don't know. But this is actually my favorite. Well, let's see. Blow it up a little bit. This one's my favorite. It's funny because now that I know that it's there, it pops right out at me. It's a good figure ground example, too. Look down in this area. Right here, there's an S, and there's an E, and there's an X. You have to look at the space, the white space. I know, then it just blows right out at you, right? You're like, how did I miss that? Yeah. I mean, and also, the flowers are all having sex, too. But, as flowers often do. All right, we've got a quick top hat thing on this idea of subliminal perception. This is a little more discussion-y than discussion-y. Is that a word? Just make that word up. So this is kind of view, just get into this idea of whether or not you think subliminal perception works, and if so, what kinds do you think work best? If not, why? I'll let you guys answer that while I run through the rest. Do you have any ideas as to what kind of subliminal advertising actually really does work? Yeah, I mean, I think certainly you associate some vehicles with more safety or masculinity. I know it's the other thing, right? People in their cars are much more tied together, their personalities. So I think a lot of that happened. Anything else? Yeah. Oh, jingles really are incessant, right? A good jingle will be with you forever. Um, I can still remember jingles from like when I was a kid, because they just are, I mean, non-stop. Right? Any thoughts about whether or not these might affect adults more than kids, or vice versa? Well, the most effective, and they're not really subliminal because you notice them, but you ever wondered why movie theaters are always popping popcorn? Always. Like movie theaters throw away more popcorn than they sell. Yeah. The smell, yeah. Same thing with Cinnabon, right? The evil Cinnabon. How many of you have ever walked into a mall food court that does not smell like cinnamon rolls? Never, right? If there's a Cinnabon, you can smell it like halfway down the food court. I don't know if they're just piping that smell out through the ventilation or whatever, but that's how they sell that stuff, right? It's not like you're consciously aware of the fact that well, some of them, I mean, certainly the Cinnabon, I think most of you go, oh, God, that smells good. I get that. But popcorn, you kind of walk in, and it also, of course, goes with the experience, etc. Research-wise, it's kind of a mixed bag as to how much subliminal perception actually affects behavior. From priming studies, and I was actually going to start consciousness, I think we're going to just end it with this. With the studies of consciousness, and we'll get into this after the exam, you can see in what are called priming studies that you can actually get, even though people don't perceive something, it does alter their behavior. Whether that builds up to buying intent has always been really controversial. So, with that in mind,